Hello and welcome to Dialogue's special series, Beyond Tariffs, the Battle for Human Prosperity. Total potential U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods have now surged to 145%. In response, China has raised tariffs on U.S. products to 125% and stated it will disregard any further tariff hikes from Washington. Meanwhile, the U.S. is maintaining a 10% universal baseline tariff and has placed additional tariffs on a 90-day pause window for potential negotiations. At a televised cabinet meeting, President Trump appeared to acknowledge the transition difficulties while claiming the investors were pleased with how the U.S. economy was being managed. But are investors truly happy with the current direction of U.S. policy? How is the rest of the world reacting to the escalating volatility? And what are the broader implications of these tariffs for global trade and world economy? Join us for today's discussion live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Timothy Stratford, former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China Affairs and a former chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in China; Anthony Moretti, Associate Professor from Robert Morris University; Dr. Chen, Chairman and CEO of the Hina Group; and Alfredo Montufar-Helu, Senior Advisor to the China Center at the Conference Board. Welcome to discussion. And so, Timothy, I will start with you. So explain to us, make sense to us, are we in a global trade war now?
I think we have to say that we are. We certainly are seeing very unusual measures taken by the United States and by other countries. And I think there's a real risk that things are already moving into very difficult territory. So I think it's hard to deny that we are in a trade war.
Well, Dr. Chen, China is the only country in the world basically exempt from the 90-day pause. China has basically has stood firm with a tit-for-tat response there. China says negotiation, the door is open, but we have to do it on equal footing and with mutual respect. What do you make of the China's stance?
I think that China and the United States, they are two of the largest economy in the world, and also the China and the U.S. probably have the largest trade partnerships in the past. So clearly, right now, the China's stance, from what we see, is to make sure that China is standing on the same foot with the United States rather than being bullied. I think that's the current situation right now.
So, Anthony, you are following the Chinese policy, Chinese development closely. And with your understanding of the Chinese stance, why China is basically is not giving the phone call Trump is waiting for?
Well, I think this becomes a question of, to go back to a comment you made at the very beginning, mutual respect. And I think what's getting lost here is that you have one person committed to basically taking a hammer to whether it's tariffs or longstanding political organizations, military organizations, etc. And you have another side that's saying, can we please talk about this rationally? And unless and until Donald Trump decides to acknowledge that, look, putting all these tariffs in place, as I did, was a mistake. And, he can use any language to try to soft sell the reason for backing down. But the reality is that enough voices finally got into his head to say, look, you are really playing with fire here. And thankfully, there's been at least some decision to pause things. Unfortunately, he's not taken that pause all the way, which I think is necessary. But what I mean by that is to also ensure that he pauses any future tariffs on China and rolls those back as well. Because as a couple of us were talking about before we started the program here, at some point it stops being tariffs and it really starts being, I'm just not going to trade with you at all. Mm-hmm. And we cannot reach that point. We absolutely cannot. And so I think what we saw from the statement from China was a sense of saying, look, this is as far as we're going to go. Beyond this, even if there's any common sense left, beyond this, common sense is totally out the door.
Well, Alfredo, basically now like 145% on the Chinese goods or 125% tariff on the U.S. goods. So people are saying that, the two largest economies, they are not trading in a sense.
Well, I mean, with that level of tariffs, of course, I can imagine that all of the importers from both sides are going to stop asking about the costs and really just start implementing measures to think about their profits. Because with that level of tariffs, of course, it's just become prohibitive to be importing at such level. But just going back to your previous question, I think that China has stated its position very clearly in a white paper they released this week, where they say they are open for negotiations, but also, again, I mean, the question is, we need to negotiate on equal footing, right? And when you think about it, and when you look back at what has been happening since President Trump started imposing tariffs on China, the Chinese government has adopted a very reactive approach to all of this, right? So they wait for the U.S. to impose, and then they retaliate. Then the U.S. responds to the retaliation. And so the corollary of all of this, from my point, is that China is expecting the U.S. to not respond to its retaliatory measures insofar as these retaliatory measures are reactive and not proactive, right? Only then would China consider that both sides are on equal footing for negotiations. The problem is that for the U.S. government, the imposition of tariffs, one of the reasons was to bring the whole trade relationship with the world to fairness, right? So for the U.S. also, I mean, the fact that you are retaliating against them would be actually mean that it's, again, unfair. So you need to actually just bear with our tariffs, and then you need to come up, knock our door, and actually ask for a deal, right? So we've reached a significant impasse, right? And it's very hard for me to see how to break out of this impasse, unfortunately.
Yeah, and of course, for a big economy like China, it's very difficult to start a negotiation with Trump. Well, basically, again, is being pointed at your head. And Timothy, help us understand, what does Trump really want? He talked about unfair trade, as Alfredo mentioned. He also talked about reindustrialization or reduction of trade deficit. Bring jobs back home. A lot of stuff. What is he really after here?
I think that President Trump is trying to reset trade relations with other countries because he thinks that in some ways they haven't been as advantageous to the United States as they could be. I think right now, as the United States and other countries are positioning themselves for negotiation, it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen in the next 24 hours. But I think we can forecast where we can expect to be in 2 or 3 years if we look at the underlying dynamics in U.S.-China trade relations. Traditionally, the United States had focused on a view of globalization and rules-based trade, but now President Trump is championing a policy of America first. But I think it's also fair to say that China is and will continue to focus on China first, as every country should do. So does that mean that if America's focused on America first and China's focused on China first, that there's no common ground for them? I don't think so. I think that if the United States is just focused on its own interest, part of that interest includes doing certain types of business with China. And I think China focuses on its own interest. Part of that interest includes doing certain types of business with the United States. And so I think the task for us is to figure out what is that common space where both the United States and China would feel that it's in their interest to be doing that type of business. If we can figure out that common space, then we can project where we may end up in the next 2 or 3 years. And my advice to governments and also to companies is to think ahead and try to take steps so that we're prepared to be in that common space in the future. Now, it could take a good number of months for us to get there. And in the meantime, first, our governments have to overcome pride and distrust. Then they have to do the complicated technical work of figuring out what that new space for economic cooperation looks like. Then they need to develop domestic political support in their own country to move in that direction. And they need to figure out how to handle the transition from the way we do business now to where we're moving to. And I think it will be a somewhat more restrictive space than we were used to in the past. But I think when both countries figure that it's in their interest to both work in that space, we can move into an era that will continue to have positive trade relations and that will be more sustainable and predictable in the future.
Well, as you said, Tim, in the past, the U.S. often stressed very much about the rules-based international order, multilateral free trade, WTO, but now, the new U.S. government stressed very much about America first. For example, sometimes it's hard to understand, their stance, their policy. The 10% tariff on Singapore and Australia. With those countries, the U.S. actually enjoy a trade surplus. Why the 10% tariff on them?
Well, I think it's been difficult to focus on a very nuanced policy for individual countries so far. I think President Trump is trying to move very quickly, and I think we'll have to see things sort of settle out in the next few months. But what I would say is, in terms of what is the underlying driver, globalization in principle is beneficial for all the countries that participate. It helps their economic growth. But in order for globalization to work, you need to maintain 6 conditions. First, you need to have a set of trading rules that all the major trading nations follow very carefully so that you can guarantee that trade and competition is conducted fairly. Secondly, you need to have a very prompt and effective enforcement mechanism so that if a country is not following the rules, you can correct the problem immediately, because otherwise, if it takes quite a while to correct the problem, then the damage will already have been done. Third, you need to maintain strong political support for globalization amongst the major trading countries. And if you don't have the strong domestic political support, that country will start to veer away from globalization. Fourth, you need to have rules that protect the environment and that protect workers. Otherwise, some countries may say, we can save costs and have cheaper products if we don't protect the environment or protect our workers. So you need to make sure you have proper rules in that respect. Fifth, you need to have rules that help countries to have resilient supply chains. And that means that sometimes you have to treat incoming products differently depending on where they come from because of supply chain resilience questions. And we haven't really had rules that have taken consideration of that. And fourth, we need to have rules that allow countries to protect their national security. And now it's difficult to do that because even in our smartphones, we have so much technology that potentially could be used by other countries for military purposes. And so all 6 of these conditions have to be in good shape in order for globalization to work. And I think most of us would think that we have serious challenges now in all 6 of those areas. So if we're going to develop, new trade relations, we've got to figure out solutions to those 6 problems in the way. And that's why this is such a challenge for so many countries.
Alfredo, go ahead.
If I may add something, I agree with those 6 points, but I would add another one, more important and underlying all of the problems that we are seeing, which is when you have globalizations, when countries open for free trade with other countries, unfortunately, there are going to be losers, right? Those that are going to be disenfranchised from the benefits of globalization. The role of governments, when that happens, is through public policy, address the negative externalities of trade and of cross-border investment. And what we have seen is that governments around the world have not been that efficient at addressing those negative externalities. Then when you are one of the people who suffer from free trade and investment, because of that suffering, because of that negative impact, perhaps you lost your job, perhaps the town where you were living, actually all of the factories moved to China, moved to Mexico. When that happens, you start hating globalization.
But Alfredo, sorry to jump in, but look, U.S. unemployment rate is low, and there's no lack of jobs, and that kind of argument.
But I'm not saying that.
Yeah, you say, manufacturing jobs go to Mexico, go to China, go to India. That's not fair. There's a problem in that kind of argument.
What I'm trying to say is that this generates, negative sentiment for globalization which actually facilitates populist and protectionist movements to take hold of power, right? And what you have seen in the US, what you have seen in Mexico, what you have seen in Brazil, what you have seen in several countries in Europe is the rise of anti-systemic movements that have become very nationalistic in how they see trade and investment. So it's easier for them to push forward these types of policies, right? So perhaps unemployment is very bad. I mean, it's not such a difficult problem or such a challenge for the U.S. But there are people who don't feel right about jobs moving somewhere else, right? So they are not looking at the data; they're looking at where they stand and what their president is promising to them, right? So what I'm trying to say is that this whole environment creates this type of sentiment against globalization and facilitates protectionism, and
Yeah.
that's what we've seen over the past decade.
Yes, yeah, protectionism, unilateralism, of course, there. But people would say, sometimes it's really about the national policies of narrowing the gap between the rich and poor. The poor may be not benefiting from that much from globalization, but probably the rich benefited a lot. So it's really up to the national governments. But anyway, let's leave that aside. I will ask Dr. Chen Hong, Trump basically backed off from his escalation of tariffs at a certain point. And is that because of the selling off of U.S. bonds or because of the pressure on the U.S. dollar? How do you see, what are the reasons? What are the factors leading to his, pause of 90-day cancellation?
Of course, the bond issue is one of the major reasons because I think one of the reasons Trump trying to solve the issue over here today is the $36 trillion in deficit, the debt, then also the $2 trillion worth of deficit, etc. So also, I think in the next 12 months, U.S. has about a $7.6 trillion of debt maturing. So they need to refinance it. Now, surprisingly, the interest rate goes up, right? Because nobody's buying the bonds. So I think that's the reason, one reason. Another reason is that President Trump's allies, those billion-dollar investors and business CEOs, have been very quiet in the past, in the last few months, not saying too much. But with the stock market is dropping like 10, 20% sometimes per day, even the major index could be dropping 17% per day. That got a lot of people's nerve up, so that they come over and put kind of I think the pressure in Trump. The third one was that clearly I think with Trump's having this kind of reciprocal tariff announced for everybody else to follow, and then suddenly he felt like with such a big number pushing out, people are going to start negotiating. And with China, it was two things. He suddenly found that a lot of countries are willing to talk, like Vietnam and others, right? And then for some countries like China, really standing firm and as you said, tick for tack, so that if there's only one China coming up with a strong position, reviewing what President Trump is proposing for the tariff, putting on the tariff, uh, if further countries come in, then it's very difficult to handle. So with these two factors, also I think all combining together, and President Trump, I think, decided to focus probably only on China right now for
Uh,
and then giving another 90 days pause.
okay. Anthony, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has to become more frank and more honest on on the U.S. side is tariffs are not going to do what Trump believes they're going to do. We know on one hand, U.S. consumers are going to pay more. We know businesses are going to suffer. But if you listen to his strategy, he says it's built on the idea of trying to bring back more American jobs, to bring back manufacturing, to, dare I say, make America great again, as he claims it will do. But the reality is that the costs associated with that are such that even if you had, and again, he claims there are billions upon billions of dollars in tariffs coming into the country. It's just simply not reality. You can throw any dollar figure you want out there, and the reality is that if tariffs are generating $2 billion, and that means American consumers are somehow coming up with a large share of that cost. For America to do what Trump wants it to do, in effect, it needs to adopt a really long-term strategy. One of the comparisons that I always make is the electric vehicle market. China did not become, or China is not in the position where it is right now because somebody woke up one morning and said, "Let's start building electrical cars." Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. This was a decade upon decade strategy. A strategy based on, okay, how does the federal government work with the provinces? How do large cities and maybe smaller cities work together as well? What kind of changes need to be made in terms of domestic employment, et cetera? These are the kinds of questions and the kinds of issues that Americans are often loath to undertake because we're so used to the quick fix. There is a saying, and that the U.S. thinks about the next quarter and China thinks about the next decade. And if you think about that strategy, essentially what that means is my stock market account doing well? If it is, great, I'm happy. If it's not, I want to point the finger of blame at somebody. But to fix the underlying problem is going to take far more than a tariff strategy, because frankly, a tariff strategy isn't going to work.
Yeah, patience and the strategy there.
Exactly.
Right. Then, Alfredo, of course, 90-day pause, window opportunity for negotiation. President Trump says, he received a lot of phone calls, basically, national leaders of other countries begging to make a deal. And so are we going to see a lot of deals to be reached, with nearly 60 countries in the next 90 days?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's impossible, and I would say that a lot of these deals have been in the making even before Liberation Day happened. However, I mean, we don't have any way of knowing the real numbers and what's happening behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. So I would say it's not impossible, but it's very hard for us to say if it's going to happen.
Yes, and so Timothy, you think like Vietnamese offered to zero tariff for the U.S. right now? Probably both sides reached agreement, and then Peter Navarro, the senior economic advisor, talked about non-tariff issue, and then said, trade deficit is not the issue. It's really about bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. or reindustrialization. What's the expectation of Vietnam, for example?
Well, I think, as has been said, it's very difficult just by tariffs alone to address some of the longer term issues. But what I can say is that the U.S. government has for years been studying trade barriers, which in the U.S. view are blocking some of the more fully developed and freer trade. And so there are reports that have been published over the last number of years, including very recently. And if I was in a particular country, I would read the report and see what barriers the U.S. government believes there are for exports to that country. And I would look and see which ones would we be in a position to try to address. And if so, there's a basis for a real discussion. And at the end of the day, if a number of these barriers with other countries are eliminated or reduced, I think President Trump would be able to claim that there has been some success. I mean, we can look at what the cost of that is, but that might be beneficial. I don't think we have to have full agreements in 90 days. If you can point to a country and say, there has been very substantial, solid progress in discussions with this country, I think that maybe the president would be willing to extend again. But I think he would have to see some real progress with that country. I don't know, of course, but perhaps some countries there will be deals. Other countries there will be significant progress, and so he may have a further pause. And then maybe if some countries there's no progress and the problems are very serious, then maybe he may treat those countries differently.
But that sounds a lot like the U.S. is making the rules for the world instead of working together with other countries to reach a multilateral trade agreement.
Well, I think the starting point is that the United States is trying to redefine the rules of its bilateral relationships with other countries. And I think every country can look at its own relations and see if those relations are beneficial. And I think China and Europe and others will be doing the same during this period. As I've said, globalization has been suffering because some of these 6 conditions have not been in a very good shape. That includes domestic political support, as we've heard. And so I think countries need to look at their own systems, and they need to look at their relations, and they need to make adjustments. And I think that's what's going to happen over the coming months.
Right. So Chen Hong, if you look at the Chinese stance, of course, China says, basically neither side will win from the trade war. Well, both countries will suffer. Obviously, the Chinese side will suffer from, say, the lack of the U.S. market, or the U.S. consumers will suffer from the lack of Chinese-made products there. How do you, assess the impact on the Chinese economy? Is China, say, able or capable of accommodating those consequences?
Yeah, first I have to say that I think it's a lose-lose situation right now. Neither side will win. Because if you look at the trade volumes between U.S. and China, is over $500 billion US a year, and US about 140. China probably has 400 something, so plus. Clearly, I think that's a big number. With the tariff is a form of tax, by the way, and people are going to have to pay higher prices. For instance, the iPhones probably price will be going up very, very quickly. Like Tesla, I just heard today, a Tesla Model S, a Model Y, which was manufactured in the United States, will be stopped selling in China as of today. So I think that's where we're going to see both sides. But also for China, if right now with such 145% tariff, it's pretty much shutting down. So the factories, they have their products manufactured, have to go somewhere. I think that's where starting the discussion between China and other countries worldwide, and make sure that they can have continuous discussion, trade discussions, negotiations, etc., to diversify some of the productions to the outside. I think that's one area. Another thing that I think I want to talk a little bit beyond that. China, as a matter of fact, could be a very, very big consumption country to the world. Right now, if you look at the PPP perspective, right? And of course, the GDP US is bigger, but the PPP in terms of PPP, China might be pretty big. So if the exchange rate change a little bit, the Chinese purchasing power could go up pretty nicely, and it could be a big consumption country like US is today. I think it's vitally important to have these 2 countries, world biggest 2 countries, to have in the future to get this kind of negotiation, trade relationship done in a much proper way. Otherwise, I think both sides will be hurt.
Right. Finally, Anthony, Ray Dalio said that, basically he's sounding the alarm, not about tariffs, but about something far more systematic. We're now seeing classic breakdowns of the major monetary, political, and geopolitical orders, like 20 seconds?
20 seconds. Excuse me, I can make it quick. I think at the end of the day, what everybody's asking for out of Donald Trump is consistency. Where is your limit? Where is your maximum? And let's negotiate from there. And I think that's what makes, the arbitrary nature of what he does so frustrating, because as a country, you think, okay, we're making good progress.
Wow.
Then all of a sudden we're not.
Right. Thank you, Anthony. With that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.